You're listening to Agile Ideas, the podcast, hosted by Fatima Abuchi. For anyone listening out there not having a good day, please know there is help out there. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Agile Ideas. I'm Fatima, CEO at Agile Management Office, Mental Health Ambassador, and your host. This podcast is made possible thanks to Agile Management Office. We help businesses in three key ways: improving organizational culture and delivery, supporting transformation and change, and streamlining governance and processes using 20 years of proven practice and the AMO Way model. In today's episode, I will be talking to Dr. Edel Langan. Edel is a heart-centered, impact-driven performance psychologist and coach who has spent the past 15 years supporting Olympic, Paralympic, and professional athletes achieve performance excellence under extreme conditions of stress and pressure. She is now deeply committed to the success of high-performing women who deep down know that they were meant for more. Her level of support is most appropriate for driven entrepreneurs, professionals, executives, and creatives who are ready to seriously uplevel some or all aspects of their life and are committed to taking radical responsibility for their results. Please join me in welcoming Edel to the show. Edel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Fatima. Lovely to be here.
It's been a busy week, as we were just briefly talking about. What's the best thing that's happened to you this week?
I think sort of what I noticed creating a lot of energy and excitement for me is I'm planning for a camp that I'm doing with the sports team next week. So I've been able to sort of link in with the leadership group, the coaching staff to put some plans together in terms of what the priorities might be for the camp and some sort of strategies and methodology to allow for us to achieve those priorities and really have impact.
Amazing. And is that an outdoor camp?
No, luckily it's an indoor camp and it's sort of up in Queensland, so the weather should be pretty good.
Oh, I'm so jealous. Please take me. So tell me a little bit about, like, most people probably now know from your bio that you're a performance psychologist and coach. What is that?
Yeah. In a nutshell, I suppose it's looking at working with sort of high performing individuals in their pursuit of what matters to them. So any performance goals that they're looking to prioritize and go after, it's working alongside them to help them develop a bit of a tolerance, a capacity, an ability to withstand the discomfort, the stress, the pressure, the uncertainty, everything that it might invite through the pursuit of that. It's upskilling them to have an ability to endure that, to sit in that, to allow for that, because it is part of the journey of pursuing what matters, the key things that are most important to us. So my job really is helping them be upskilled and ready to cope with the different demands that pursuit of things that are meaningful will demand of them.
And I'm fascinated by the word, endure and cope, because a lot of the time you hear about, and going through things, and sometimes people try to avoid them, but actually enduring them and coping with them is actually a better approach.
Oh, completely. It's part of it, unfortunately, but it is the natural human condition to sort of escape or avoid or try and get out of discomfort. And the hard part and what we know to be true about life is that we can definitely escape, we can avoid, but generally what tends to happen is that in taking that choice and engaging the escape behaviors, it tends to sort of derail us, and we tend to move away from what matters. We tend to show up unlike our preferred self. So really, it's sort of taking us away from alignment. So really, to get back on track and to go after what matters, we need to open up to the discomfort. We need to make space for it and sit in that, because it is part of pursuing what matters to us. And generally, when we do look back on the things that we have achieved and the successes that we have obtained, what we tend to notice is that discomfort has been part of that journey. So really,
and would you say the discomfort is both sometimes physical and mental?
Yeah, it's physical, it's mental, it's emotional, it's the whole beautifully human experience.
Yes.
And it's that ability to accept that is part of it. So by acceptance, I mean, we don't necessarily have to like it or agree with it. We can just acknowledge it for what it is, which is it's part of being human. And I think in that acceptance, it allows for us to sit in a position where we're relational with it, we can actually open up to it and create space for it, because we're no longer sort of enduring a suffering through that, because we're trying to fight it or get rid of it. So it creates a very different relational space where I can actually allow for that without judging it as good, bad, right or wrong. I like it or I don't like it. So it's actually a key sort of mechanism that is necessary, particularly when we're going after the things that matter in life.
It's amazing and very fascinating. My curiosity is how you ended up in the sports psychology space, because that's obviously a niche in itself.
Yeah, it was actually through my own experience in competitive swimming. So as soon as I could talk, I was put in the swimming pool, and then sort of naturally progressed up through the pathway to then compete at a national level. And for me, it was a noticing of the capacity I was demonstrating in training. It wouldn't necessarily always translate when it came to competing. There was something in the competition experience that was really challenging me, and I couldn't quite get through the barriers of that. So I'm a very curious learner. So I was captivated by this in exploring it from an academic point of view, to sort of really get a grasp on why does this happen? How do we navigate it? And also just a real sort of desire to be of service for others who pursue things that are important to them in life, things that challenge them, and a wanting to I suppose sit alongside them in guiding them around how you go about achieving greatness, and what are the necessary mechanisms that you can leverage to support you in pursuit of that.
And did you find that working with different athletes, that there was a difference depending on what sport that they were playing? I'm always just curious about these things.
Yeah, it's definitely depending on the sports, that would naturally dictate the particular needs and challenges that the athletes come up against. So even like whether it's a team sport or an individual sport, but the individual needs to exist as part of a system. There's definitely, each sport offers its own unique challenges, but again, across those various challenges, you will find there are general themes or trends or patterns that tend to show up, particularly in high functioning individuals. So I've noticed a similar sort of presentation in leaders in the corporate sector. Because again, we are sort of beautifully human here, and the human condition is quite predictable in just how we go about tolerating uncertainty, stress, and just various emotions.
And speaking of the corporate space, one of the things that I hear a lot, and sometimes I wonder if I'm in this category, about around the high functioning anxious person, like,
yeah,
tell me a bit more about that, and how does that play out?
Yeah, I think because in my space in the corporate sector, I work predominantly with high functioning women. And typically what tends to show up is the anxiety can be present in the context of the challenge in holding positive tension. So allowing for diversity in opinion, allowing for people to sort of see things differently or experience it differently, and still come together and find a connectedness through the discomfort or the tension that it's inviting. Because sometimes there can be a mindset around we need to be the same, we need to be like each other in order for us to move forward. So the anxiety can be in holding that and tolerating the discomfort that can show up there. And I think also what I've noticed is sort of a challenge in, I suppose, tolerating and a sort of a stance around assertiveness. Where predominantly women can tend to be of service and really want to be available and supportive of others, almost to the detriment of that individual then honoring their own independence and development of a skill set. So it's that fine line between me showing up and supporting you versus enabling you. And I think the challenge that presents and how it can show up from an anxiety point of view is that sometimes when we abandon ourselves to be of service of others, it can create an underlying sort of resentment and frustration, because really I'm not being aligned with my true self, my true needs here. I'm deprioritizing myself in the service of supporting you right now. And that feels not fair, sort of subconsciously, so that it can show up in many ways for women. So that ability to tolerate that and balance my needs with your needs can be a real challenge at the best of times.
And would you say it's more common in women than in men? And this goes to one of the things I hear a lot about is around the people pleasing part, which seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, more evident in females than males.
Yeah, I think in my experience anyway, women tend to be sort of predominantly sort of positioned in a caring role, where the natural nature or disposition then is to show up and be of service of others, and that then can influence sort of the beliefs we hold and sort of the roles we undertake. A lot of it sort of subconsciously, which can then play out and really influence our experience of that, and whether we find meaning and purpose and fulfillment, or whether we're just sitting in a lot of frustration and resentment, but not feeling like we have a capacity or ability to really speak to that.
And why do you think that us women tend to put up those barriers? Like, is it some sort of imposter syndrome? Do we feel like we're maybe not good enough, or is it something else?
It's probably a bit of all of that, Fatima. I think it is a bit of sort of challenge around some of the potential limiting beliefs that we hold about ourselves and our ability and the role we play and the skill set we have. It can be many reasons for different people, but I think some of the key things you spoke to there around my sense of worth, my value, my ability to stand up and honor myself and speak to what I deserve. Sometimes there can be beliefs around the impact of that and how the other person might tolerate that or cope with that, and then what it might mean for what I'm left managing. So there is a bit of a relational dynamic that can play out there that would challenge the woman to be able to have a skill set to be able to move through that, where again we're holding positive tension around that. And the value in doing that is because I know sort of my worth, I know what I deserve, and I know that it is okay, I have a right to express my needs here.
And are you seeing in your line of work, as you've evolved in your career, that there's been a positive shift to more women standing up and speaking up and overcoming some of these challenges?
I am. And it's something that quite excites me. There's nothing more than I love than sitting with a client who's able to sort of express some like positive behavioral change in moving into a space that inevitably invites discomfort, but it also is allowing for her to do something that is very courageous, and it is something that is a bit different. And the sense of empowerment and pride and satisfaction that the client then shares as a result of doing that courageous behavior, it can be really exciting to hear about that. And I am noticing a lot more change in that space. And sort of that's, I suppose, for me, why I've stepped into this space, because I want to be of service and I want to support women in pursuit of this, in standing for what they deserve and going after what matters most to them.
And in comparing your corporate work and the work that you've done in the sports space, what would you say the similarities or differences between the two?
Yeah, I think there is sort of an underlying sort of what I call like a bit of an unrelenting standards belief system, where again, sort of we are quite unrelenting. We have an insatiable appetite to do hard things and to do them often. So there is that sort of common mindset that seems to exist across both performance contexts. I think also that there can be that approval seeking part where we're doing things in the service of trying to influence another person's opinion or judgment of me, because that is something that I value. It's something that's important to me. So it can show up across both as well. But I think the most dominant one is that unrelenting standards, that faster, harder, stronger, fitter mindset, and being quite unrelenting in exploring all different methods to get the performance outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because when I first met and we spoke briefly about sort of what, even just thinking about performance coaching in the corporate space, you usually hear the word performance and you often do think about, the sports space, but just seeing how some of the principles that you apply in that space can apply in a corporate setting is quite interesting. How do you help someone to make that mindset shift where maybe they're not really aware of maybe challenges or of their own battles that they're facing? So how do you get them to see that in order to make the improvements that they need to grow?
Yeah, I think like with anything, it always starts with building an insight and awareness around the current reality. And that can sometimes be quite confronting in looking at who I think I am versus who I really am being. And so really it's a strategy around exploration of self and really looking at it through a realistic lens around the things I'm doing, the choices I'm making that support alignment in what matters to me, and potentially what might be derailing me or pulling me away from that, and some of the underlying hooks or mechanisms that are supporting that, and potentially some short-term rewards that I'm getting out of that might fuel the sort of avoidance or sort of overcompensatory behaviors that tend to show up as a way of trying to cope with some of the discomfort that is inevitably part of that experience as well. And I think what's also quite important as part of that journey is really getting down to why does this matter? Mm-hmm. Because really, without the why or real clarity around that, what I tend to find is the ability to endure, to tolerate, and to sit in sort of pain, because it's part of life. The suffering is optional, but the pain to sort of to allow for that and to tolerate that, we've got to have a reason for why it's worth it. Mm-hmm. But if I'm not really authentically connected with my why, then my ability to tolerate and sit in that will generally be quite limited and restricted. And then I'll naturally default to look for different ways that are unhelpful to cope with that. Mm-hmm. So part of my early work will be looking at, well, why does this matter to you? Of all the things, tell me why this matters. And to begin with, I suppose I hear a bit around the first reason why it matters, and then you'll naturally sort of dig a bit deeper to get to sort of authentically why it really matters to the client.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because in a lot of corporate settings where we hear about organizations trying to change the mindset, particularly Agile space, which we play in, there's a lot of talk about, oh, we need to change our mindsets, but no one's actually doing the work to create that awareness to help drive that change.
Yes.
These things take time. So maybe they need to take some notes out of your book to help them get from where they are going to where they want them to be.
Yeah, and I think it is it's a real challenge to take on, because like as you've highlighted there, it's not something that can be quickly resolved or recalibrated overnight. It is an ongoing commitment to doing some deep transformative work, and that is sort of the type of work that I do. I generally don't engage clients who are looking for a short-term fix. And really, if you are looking at a complete transformation here, it requires a deep commitment to looking at your reality, and then what are the necessary skills you need to get back on track more often. So I think I can completely understand and empathize with organizations who can name it logically, and they know this is really important. And then the challenge sits around, well, how do we strategically begin to address this, and who are the key support people that we can leverage for this?
And what advice would you give? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people on here that are listening that are like me, who probably deal and face that whole imposter syndrome space, and constantly haunted by it. What sort of advice could you give for someone to address that?
Yeah, I think for me, like, the imposter syndrome is part of being beautifully human. Like, I can even relate to that myself. And for me, I see it as a real sort of badge of honor, where it shows that you're brave enough to be a novice and you're brave enough to go after what matters. So it's that welcoming and allowing for that to be part of the experience, knowing that it won't always be that way. And the reality being that it will evolve, it will change, it won't always be there. But it's that ability to allow for it and accept it as part of the learning journey. We will have to, as part of our journey, sit in, I don't know, I'm completely uncertain, I'm so confused. That is part of it. We don't get to escape that or bypass that. But if we can develop a relational stance where we can allow for that without getting stuck in it, what you tend to find is that we're able to move through it a lot quicker. Whereas once we start resisting it, it will persist. So I think it's that, for me, it's that acknowledgement that it's part of it, and that ability to open up and allow for it, because it's a real badge of honor. I see it as a key strength, because it shows that I'm courageous. It shows that I'm willing to step into the arena here and do brave things in the service of going after what matters to me. And that means at times I won't know. And yeah, that sucks. It's really hard to sit in. And I can also make space for that, because it's okay and it's part of my journey.
It's a really fascinating point, because when I think about sort of what I've tried to do in working in that space, it was about not being too hard on myself and judging myself too hard. When I made a shift in the last 12 months, it's really transformed how I am, I think, as a person, because I used to judge myself harshly because of that imposter syndrome. And now it's, like I said, everything's a bit of an experiment, and you just have to go through the motions, and that's part of the coping.
Yeah, and I think like I hear you show up for yourself in a very different way for how you're coping with that. And I think that's like I suppose you've touched on inner critic there and that voice that can tend to be quite harsh, quite negative, at times quite punitive on us, which induces a lot of self-loathing. So that ability to relate differently to that and leverage a different voice that is very wise, that is caring, that is loving, it's a completely different way of navigating the same experience. And, it's great to hear that you've experienced the benefits of that.
And then thinking about sort of just generally trying to, a lot of us climb the corporate ladder and, we're trying to exceed our previous performance on year and doing all of these things. How has it been to help someone who maybe has gotten to where they think they are as the pinnacle of their success and then realize it's not what they wanted and effectively maybe on the verge of burnout perhaps? Like, how do you sort of guide those people?
I think it is pretty common in the space I work where we have this insatiable desire and appetite to go after things that matter to us. And then we find in ourselves in a position where we've actually achieved that. And for some people, what can kick in is a sort of a dismissing of that, and then something else kicks in. So a desire for something new, a desire for something further. So it becomes a bit of a hamster wheel where we're constantly pursuing a certain state of being, a certain type of experience where we will then feel a sense of joy, yet a sense of satisfaction, a sense of feeling good enough. And I think that tends to show up in clients then that would present with burnout, with fatigue, with exhaustion, with the state of complete sort of disconnect from the pursuit of what they originally thought mattered to them. And for many sort of clients, what has showed up there is some grief in terms of the idea of what I thought this would be, the fantasy around what I had told myself it would be like versus then the harsh reality of what I'm sitting in. And that kind of sucks. So in that space, for some people, it's been really sort of confronting to really acknowledge and allow for the reality of that. Like I know, for example, with some athletes post Tokyo, they didn't have the type of Tokyo experience they expected, particularly due to COVID and everything. And it was really difficult to unpack that and debrief it and make sense of it and allow for all of the feelings that naturally show up in the service of doing that. So I think it can be all the feels when we pursue things that matter and when we then get to obtain them and experience them. And then what that then brings up for us can always be a really curious, confronting experience to have.
And I guess this is where adaptability is key, because they would have had to adapt maybe their perceptions of what would have been had they not had to go through that ordeal.
Exactly, yeah. And it also then is a real coming back and a checking in around, well, is this something I still want for myself? And being very like radically honest when for so long I've told myself this is what matters the most.
Yeah.
And that in itself can be really sort of confronting and really difficult to sit in. But it is that always coming back to conscious choice here rather than habitual ways of making choices and being guided by what we think is most important. It's that ability to come back and really check in and be curious with yourself in terms of, why am I doing this? Why does it matter most?
And I think I read through, I'm assuming about our notes, that you talk about choices available to you. You mentioned,
yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, like I think I love the curiosity towards the reality that we're always choosing. And what we know to be true in terms of being beautifully human is we tend to uh, make choices based off what we know is most familiar. So we tend to be quite habitual and seek things that are familiar and the same. So it's that ability to come back to a conscious choice rather than habitual choices. And naturally, when we're making choices, there is that recognition of sometimes there's a story I tell myself about this choice and what it means to me. And that ability, as I said, to be radically honest with yourself about this choice and how it serves you or doesn't serve you. But that ability to discern between the both of these, and then sort of come back to what is a conscious choice that I would like to make here. And it is that, I suppose, reality that at any given moment you are committing to like a future self based on the present choices that you're making. And it might be a case that your present self is saying yes, but your future self is saying no.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so it's sort of that recognition of like the current choices I'm making and how
Yeah.
that's going to influence and
Yeah.
impact my future self, and whether she will stay aligned or
Yes.
now end up sort of redirected and misaligned because of what I'm saying yes to right now.
And it's really interesting because at the end of the day, when we think about it, you're right, everything we do in life, whether how we react to it, how we respond, it's our choice on how we choose to feel about something. And one of the things that I know I've heard a lot about is, when it comes to anxiety and the experiences I've dealt with, a lot of the time I'm reminded, like, no one has control over my thoughts or my feelings about
Yes.
the situation. It's my choice if I want to be angry or sad or happy. And I think that definitely helps align to that context.
Yeah, and I think you captured it beautifully there. And there's two choices here. I can react to this or I can respond to this. And one is very conscious and deliberate versus one is a very much the emotional brain potentially hijacking the system. And then there's no real choice point. It's just an automated response that can be quite reactive and emotionally laden. But it is that ability to recognize there are two choices here, and in order for me to make choice A and choice B, what are the necessary tools or skills that I need in order for that to happen?
And then thinking about, we just briefly were talking about the Tokyo with the athletes, but just think about highs and lows in general. I'm
Yeah.
sure you've worked with athletes that have, strived their whole career for success and perfection, and then maybe have had a career-ending injury.
Mm.
How have you either helped them cope or adjust to that, what would be an extremely horrible and difficult situation?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed as I've sat in that space with athletes is it depends on the injury or the reason they've no longer participating in the sport, whether that was a choice, a conscious choice of theirs, or whether it was something that derailed that, so potentially a sudden injury. And it can be really and what I noticed is the experience can be very different depending on whether I had choice around that or not. And generally, for the athletes who don't have choice around it, it naturally brings up a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and a lot of grief, like sadness, because really what I'm being confronted with is the loss of an expectation or an idea I had about my future self and what that was going to look like. And that can be really confrontational. So really, my role has been creating a space where we can sort of support the unpacking of that and the much needed emotional expression of all of that, the frustration, the anger, the sadness. It's all very valid and such a beautifully human, very normal experience in response to quite like a traumatic event. For it to be career ending and it wasn't my choice, like that's a lot for somebody to go through.
Yeah, it's almost unimaginable for the majority of people who, you spend your whole life. I can't even
Yeah.
imagine how difficult it be. On the corporate side, I see a lot of in this sort of in what we hear from a lot of the sort of statistics from Beyond Blue and the work that they do is that a lot of people that are going into retirement have retired, that they really struggle for many instances. Do you see that within the corporate space as well?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's been really interesting. It tends to show up when a lot of our identity, our sense of worth and value has been predominantly funneled into the workspace, when who I am is very much defined by the role I play at work. Because naturally, then when I no longer have access to that or I need to let go of that, there's a real confrontation in terms of like, well, who am I then if I'm not a manager, if I'm not a CEO, if I'm not a CIO? That really can be quite like confronting for somebody to sit in and then question when for so long they've really put everything into a particular identity, versus sort of leaders who have been able to sort of more holistically develop themselves and nurture parts of themselves outside of the role, value their self-care, value their passions, their interests, their connections. I tend to notice that their ability to adapt and transition tends to be a lot easier for them to make.
And thinking about the key word being transition, I know that it's not about waiting until a point in life where you've got a crisis or you're retiring, or you've got some sort of situation, but actually working on yourself early and actually seeking that help and speaking to someone, because as much as we think we can do it ourselves, it makes such a difference to have professionals to actually help guide us. And I couldn't recommend having that conversation and working with someone, similar to what you do as well, which I think is imperative for our success.
Yeah, I think it's just a really nice way to be held, and for somebody to support and offer guidance. And ultimately, you're in the driving seat and making, the choices along the way. But for somebody to be able to support and offer some guidance and some practical skills to move through that can be really helpful along the way.
Especially in that non-judgmental way, you're not tied to the outcome. So I think that makes a big difference. I think one of the things I read that you talk about is radical responsibility. So I'm thinking, like, with what I've heard in the conversations we've had today about your experiences, is I feel like you're helping to drive radical accountability as well. But what do you see when you say radical responsibility? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it is that ability to sort of wholeheartedly and very completely like lean in and accept responsibility for your life and the choices that you're making, as hard as that might be sometimes, to look at that and then be accountable to that. As we've kind of highlighted, there is an unconscious part of us that naturally makes choices, compels us to move in a certain way, urges us to take action. And part of that will seek comfort. And we know that part of living a life worth meaning and value, it means making space for discomfort. So it is that part where we can radically step up and take responsibility for the choices that we're making, and look for how we might change, how we might look to take different actions, show up differently, relate differently to our inner dialogue, rather than waiting for others to change and expecting for things to be different there. Because I think in my line of work, what I also notice is sometimes when things are discomforting, and particularly when it is relational, we're doing everything we possibly can to make the other person change, because what they're doing right now is discomforting for us. Mm-hmm. And so we put so much effort into the other person and working on them and getting them to change, when realistically, what I sort of will come to is like, well, what are you doing within yourself to take responsibility for your own behavior here, and how this potentially might be contributing to like the issues that are presenting, mm-hmm. and how might you show up differently, change what you're doing if we completely let go of the other person, because the reality is you cannot influence them. They will make their own choices in life, and waiting for them to change means that you're sitting in resentment and frustration.
It's a really good point. You really can't change other people for the most part. I mean, even with our families, sometimes I think we can't influence them to change. They've got to want to do it for themselves. And I think maybe that's why people don't necessarily, well, at least from what I hear, like a lot of people don't want to seek help because they don't believe they need it, or they don't feel like you can't force them to get the help. But I think it would make such a difference.
Yeah. And I think the reality is, if you're forcing them, it's a control mechanism. Yeah. So again, you're trying to control another person. So what's driving that need for you to control somebody else?
Mm-hmm. So rather than trying to change them, change the way that you respond or react to that situation.
Yeah, because really what you're doing is you're outsourcing the responsibility for change there. Yeah. And what I notice in my space, and particularly when it comes to leaders and people that they are leading, there's a dance we're doing between trading of anxiety. I'm either going to hold my anxiety and manage it, or I'm going to outsource it, put it on you, because that helps me in the moment feel comfortable.
Yeah, that's actually very fascinating. There's a lot of us that do that. I've definitely seen that happening.
Yeah. And I think that is the reality, where, again, we are beautifully human, so it will happen. It's just having that awareness around when it's happening. It's just that ability to then check in around, okay, is this something that, honors me and is something that I'm consciously choosing, or now knowing this, would I like to show up a bit different?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So thinking about everything you've learned now in your career and all of the studies you've done, if you can go back in time, what would be some life advice that you would give yourself, knowing what you know now?
I think picking up on what you've highlighted there, the sort of the value and impact of self-compassion, and how helpful that can be in allowing for you to move through the key challenges that present through life. I think naturally, as part of being a high-performing female myself, like I fell victim to the critical thoughts, and they sort of kept me stuck for quite a while. So I think if I was to go back and share some wisdom or advice, it would be really really to emphasize the value and the peace, that sort of the self-compassion, the kindness, particularly being kind to yourself whilst you're suffering, like the impact that can have is profound. So I think leveraging that wisdom would be really helpful if I could go back and speak with my past self.
I think more of us need to have that opportunity. Maybe one day it'll be invented. Who knows? That's amazing. It's been definitely very insightful. I'm keen to sort of share with our listeners, how can people get involved with your work, or where can they get more information?
So they can send me an email. So it's edel@levelup-ppc.com.au. I've currently got a website under development, so hopefully we'll be launching on the 30th of June. So hopefully people can connect with me through that platform as well.
Amazing. And you're on LinkedIn as well?
Yes, I am on LinkedIn.
Amazing. We'll put all of this in the show notes and make sure that people can get in touch with you. Before we wrap up today, Edel, which has been a very insightful conversation for me and quite selfish because of the questions I was asking, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners, a call to action, a piece of advice, or a question to ponder?
I think it's more that acknowledgement that going after what matters to you in life, and the reality of that being that it will demand something different of you. And inevitably, we will go through so much change. I think we underestimate how much change we go through. So I think if you can show up for yourself, find a way to tolerate that in the service of staying connected to what matters to you, you will find then that life for you is very fulfilling and meaningful. And that in itself can be very transformative.
I love it. Show up for yourself. Be your biggest cheerleader, 100%.
Exactly, yes.
No, that's been amazing. Thank you so much, Edel. I really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure having you on board.
No worries. Thank you so much, Fatima.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Please share this with someone or rate it if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and to stay up to date with all things Agile ideas, go to our website www.agilemanagementoffice.com. I hope you've been able to learn, feel, or be inspired today. Until next time, what's your Agile idea?